Today we'll be discussing the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly referred to as OPEC, and its relation with trade. So some background of OPEC. It was founded in 1960 with five founding countries. Those five were Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. So OPEC's mission is to ensure the stabilization of oil markets in order to secure an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to consumers, a steady income to producers, and a fair return on capital for those investing in the petroleum industry. And with this mission, they're really trying to have the best outcome for all parties involved in the oil industry. So becoming a member, um, a country that wants to become a new member has to be a substantial net exporter of oil and receive at least three-fourths of the votes of current OPEC countries. And aside from the full members, there are also associate members, and these countries do not meet the full membership requirements, whether it be oil reserves or um, not having the production quotas, but they're allowed admission with special circumstances. To current member countries, as of January 2020, there were 13 member countries of OPEC, and here's a list of the 13 as well as the years that they joined. Of the 13, all five of the founding members are still members of OPEC. And along with these countries, there are also other countries who have been members at some point, and three that have left OPEC in the last few years were Ecuador, Indonesia, and Qatar. And these countries withdrew due to concerns around membership fees, which are a few $1 million a year, production quotas, either wanting to produce more than what OPEC would allow or not being able to meet the minimum requirement. And they also have left due to investment in oil alternatives. So here's a map of the 2020 OPEC countries. As you can see, many of the members are in the Middle East or Africa, with a few countries in South America. So OPEC as a trade bloc. A trade bloc is an intergovernmental agreement where barriers to trade, such as tariffs, are reduced or eliminated among participating states. And OPEC has a dominant position of the oil market. There's an estimation of between 40 and 50% of the world's oil production comes from the 13 OPEC members, as well as over 80% of the world's proven oil reserves are from OPEC countries. So originally, OPEC sought to fight multinational oil companies, set higher global prices, and nationalize oil to have government control. And today, most OPEC countries own all of their oil reserves, so they've done a very good job of nationalizing oil. And there have been recent tensions with the United States and Russia, both due to fracking and the supply of oil. And these two countries are non-members, which has caused the tension because they are not listening and on board of what OPEC is saying. So Jackson will get more into that.
Hey guys, it's Jackson. Continuing on what Rob said about OPEC being a trade bloc, being involved in a trade bloc, OPEC also acts as a cartel, even though cartels usually get negative connotation as drug trafficking and drug trade in South America and Mexico and coming into the United States. But we're actually talking about how just organizations can be cartels if they are trying to regulate supply in order to maintain high prices. And OPEC actually does this with their oil production. So they'll try to produce less in order to drive up price or restrict competition in order to maintain a high price in oil. So the next slide, we'll talk about how OPEC actually can cause some of these oil shortages. And so they actually had an embargo against the United States in 1973, which was known as the Oil War after in the aftermath, and it just kind of they stopped selling oil or exporting oil to the United States, which inherently drove up prices. for the United States, and there was no supply, and so they were forced to use their own supply in oil, and it really put a damper on the U.S. economy. And I'll show in the next slide how there was a recession for a couple of years because of the shortage and how it really affected the economy. As you can see in the pictures below, the gas shortage, they were limiting customers to how much gas they could take out, and how much gas they could use to fill up their cars. And they actually made a couple legal changes. They dropped the speed limit so that people would, they use less gas in order to get from point A to point B, and so they're not revving their motors up and down the highway and stuff like that, so that they can reduce their output in oil and use less. And so here's that graph I was talking about. You can see in the early 1970s, those gray bars are actually points where there's a recession, and you can see the blue line there is actually the price of oil. So you can see it was in the low 20s in the early 1970s, and it jumped during that export embargo to about $60. So you can see it almost tripled there, and that put a huge damper on the U.S. economy. And so OPEC actually has a couple countries that it talks to and has some alliance with, and they want to, control prices with them because they're also some oil exporting countries. So these include Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Brunei, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, South Sudan, and Sudan. And Russia is actually the main leader of OPEC Plus. And these 10 additional countries, um, they kind of aim to fix the global crude oil prices. And so they're teaming up with OPEC, but they don't have like the requirements to be in OPEC, or they don't want to pay the fee to be in OPEC, um, or else they would be in OPEC. Um, Another reason you don't want to be, or maybe you wouldn't want to be in OPEC, is that you have to kind of play by their rules. So I think Russia, that's one of the reasons why they're not in OPEC. Technical difficulties there. So we'll continue by talking about how OPEC can be compared to other large countries in the world who are producing oil. So OPEC actually produces 44% of the world's total oil output per day, but they can boast of 81.5% of the world's total oil reserves that they have on hold. So they have a large supply um, that they just kind of have on hold in case anything goes wrong, like this current COVID crisis is causing with the oversupply in oil. So in 2019, this graph only goes till 2018, but in 2019, the United States produced about 15 million barrels per day, and so there you can see their dark blue chart, or their dark blue line, steadily or greatly increasing every year after 2012 there, to catch up to Saudi Arabia, who's an OPEC country, and Russia, who's a big competitor in the oil production. And so you can also see that Saudi Arabia in 2019 was at about 12 million barrels per day, and Russia was at 10.8 million barrels per day, which is the largest three in the world today. And I think the next one is an OPEC country. I think it's Iran, who's at about 5 million barrels per day. And so OPEC today has a very low demand for their production of oil because of COVID-19, and a lot of the problems are due to less transportation, and people are kind of staying at home and working from home, so there's less use of public transportation that has a large demand for oil, and people aren't driving their cars around as much as they did 3 months ago, which has taken a big hit on the oil market today. And so on March 5th, 2020, OPEC gathered and decided to cut production of oil in order to keep a high price for their oil, because of the falling demand. They wanted to keep supply low. And so OPEC was encouraging Russia to do the same, as well as the other OPEC plus countries. but Russia declined their suggestion to cut production because they kind of wanted to do their own thing, and they were like, "Hey, we're not going to cut our supply. We're going to keep producing the same. Like we don't think the prices are going to be as affected as much as you think." But um, so the prices actually dropped a bunch, and it caused a huge problem um, among the OPEC countries, and they actually just struck a deal today, actually on April 12th, 2020, that includes the U.S. and it basically says that all OPEC countries and OPEC plus countries, including the United States, are going to have to cut oil production. And so I talked about how in 2019 the U.S. produced 15 million barrels of oil per day, and now they're cutting back, and in 2020 I think they're going to cut production back to 11.8 million barrels per day, which is a big chunk. And it's all due to these falling demand in oil, and they're trying to cut the supply in order to keep that oil price at bay, and keep it up as high as they can. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and I hope you find it very informative.